Hello, my friends. Why don't mountains catch colds? They wear snow caps. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. The bustling streets of New York were always alive, day or night. Huge skyscrapers towering above the rest of the buildings dotted across the city. Thousands of people constantly moved around the city, going in different directions. Vehicles constantly moving around, occasionally stopping in the moment of a rush hour. At night, lights would brighten up the night sky, no matter how dark it was. The city of New York was always alive with good energy. However, for 2 weeks, two sources of powerful dark energy visited the city. Atop a skyscraper, two young men looked down on the city with hoods pulled over their heads. The man on the left wore a black hood with black jeans, whilst his brother wore a white hood with blue jeans. Both of the boys wore black gloves. The black-hooded boy's name was Callum and his brother's name was Michael. They had come from a troubled past, and that troubled past had corrupted them. They did have their humanity, of course, but they weren't exactly human. Not all humans. So, where are we going to sleep tonight, Callum? Callum turned to his brother, acknowledging his question. He then pointed his finger towards a block of flats. The area was dirty, the walls were practically covered with strange graffiti tags and the floors were littered with all types of trash. There. I've recently had a look and I've found a decent room. Fortunately for us, there are 2 people who live there. This should be easy. Michael nodded. He smirked, ready for what they called fun. Any other human being would be disgusted by their acts, but nobody saw them. The 2 boys knew how to blend in, quite literally. As the night went on, the boys slowly walked back to the center of the building. Callum slowly grabbed 2 black and white backpacks and slung one at Michael. Michael then picked up their most powerful weapon, the book. The book was their source of knowledge. Because of their demonic hybrid state, they were able to read the bizarre text within. The book had shown them many things, such as new ways to use their abilities. The pages were rough, no worse than the battered cover of the book, but the text hadn't been ruined by the book's rough state. Michael placed the book into his backpack. The boys then slung the packs onto their backs and slowly walked towards the edge of the building. For a small moment, they both began to scan the streets, searching for a shadow. Eventually, they both found one. Callum then spoke. "All right, let's split up. I'll take the left, you take the right. I'll meet you there." Michael nodded. "All right then, see you later then." Then, the 2 boys jumped. Within mere seconds, the roaring wind began to rush past Callum and Michael as they continued to dive. Callum laughed to himself. He continued to rush towards the ground, performing another daredevil stunt. The ground began approaching him rapidly. Then, it all stopped. The wind was silent. Callum and Michael had disappeared. For a moment, the city was relieved of the dark energies. Only a few people reported seeing 2 men sprinting across the streets, leaping over benches and trash cans. Minutes later, the moonlight was shrouded in the darkness of the night sky. The boys had reached their destination. The flat was silent and practically empty. The only things that proved that the flat did have occupants were the pair of lifeless bodies that lay before the 2 boys. The room was dark, and somewhat untidy, with the chairs and tables kicked over in the victim's desperate attempt to escape. The boys just stared for a moment, wiping their spikes clean with nearby towels. Then Michael turned to Callum. "So, how do you want to dump the bodies? Bury them or burn them?" Callum stood still for a moment, slowly making his decision. He then shook his head. No. Maybe this time we should take care of them properly. He then slowly got down onto one knee and examined the two bodies. The two men who lay before them were in their middle ages. Their clothes were ripped where the two boys had attacked them. Callum stuck out his forefinger and middle finger and slowly covered their eyes with their eyelids. He then took their hands and placed them on their hearts. Michael watched in awe, amazed at how gentle his brother could be, given the circumstances. Afterward, Callum stood up and took off his backpack. All right. Set your stuff up in any room you like. Good night. Michael nodded and smiled at his brother. Okay then, see you in the morning, Callum. Michael turned then slung his backpack across the room. He then turned and slowly made his way to the bathroom. Callum then walked off to the bedroom, ready for a good night's rest. He took off his hood, his demonic features revealed. His red eyes were lazy and his long red smile had become more of a tired expression. Callum opened the bedroom door and entered. From the doorway, he studied his surroundings. The bed practically took up the entire room, fitting in perfectly with the size of the room. Only one window occupied the small room. Clothing and other miscellaneous objects were scattered across the room, hidden within the cracks and placed all over the floor. It would have to do. Callum slumped onto the bed, slowly putting his head onto the pillow. He began to think about the time he had spent with his brother. All the people they had killed and the regret he sometimes felt afterward. The places they had been, the sights they had seen and the moments before it all happened. The lab, the scientists and his mother and father. Finally, he fell asleep. A smartly dressed butler entered a room, lit up by candles. The wallpaper was a dark orange, and in each corner of the room, a large candle was placed upon the wall. In the middle of the room, a man sat in a wooden chair, in front of a brown desk, scattered with papers, pens and a single picture at the corner of the desk. The man at the desk didn't face the butler but only turned his back on him. The butler spoke. "Sir, we have a problem. We have lost Kyle and Ashley. Their monitors have died. We don't know what happened. But all we do know is that we lost our biggest dealers in New York." The man didn't respond for a moment. But then, in a deep British voice, he spoke. "Such a shame. I rather liked them. They were big parts of my business. Nobody messes with my business. Whatever happened to them is still a mystery. But if somebody killed them, they must die. I don't care who gets hurt or what happens. This must be dealt with. Listen, Bentley, send out Joe to deal some more and try to lure the killer out. Do it." That night, Callum tossed and turned in his bed. His dreams were horrifying. All he could see was a pitch-black shadow, and all he could hear was the whispers of his parents. He cried out, trying to stop it or and wake up. But he couldn't. No matter what he tried, all he could do was listen to the whispers of the people he had lost. Eventually, he awoke, gasping and terrified. He looked around him, seeing that he was still in the same room where he had slept that night. Suddenly, a backpack landed on his bed, making him jump. He glanced up to meet the eyes of Michael, smiling. His brother then spoke. "Morning, sleepyhead. Come on, it's about time we left. People might be suspicious of what happened. Let's go get breakfast." Callum nodded and dragged the pack towards him. He then pulled up his hood and walked out of the room, completely unaware of the immense danger he was in. The city park was filled with nature of all kinds. Trees dotted the areas, forming shelters with their many leaves. The grass slowly swayed in the wind, bringing life to the concrete jungle. Callum sat on a bench, a plastic coffee cup in one hand and a burger in the other. Michael leaned up against a nearby tree, slurping from his cup. They had lingered by that place for a while, talking to each other. "So Callum, who should we go for this time?" "Him?" "What about him?" "It's up to you." Callum looked from left to right, scanning his surroundings. All he could see was ordinary people, surrounded by friends and family. He then saw a family of 4, complete with a father, mother and 2 sons. Even though he tried to fight it, Callum couldn't help but think of his parents, his younger days and when they were still alive. A small feeling of sadness slowly crawled over him as he tried to remain strong. Then his vision caught a new sight, a middle-aged man, wearing a particularly large coat, walking towards an alleyway. This interested him. He then said to Michael, "Hey, see that guy with the big coat?" Michael nodded. "How about him? He seems interesting." Michael smiled in a somewhat malicious manner and began to travel down the concrete path, with Callum quickly catching up to him. As the mysterious man started to walk down the alleyway, the boys began to run, trying to stay out of his vision as best as they could. Eventually, after reaching the alleyway and waiting outside for a few seconds, they entered. The area was littered with cigarettes and the raw stench of sewage swirled near the boys' noses. Dirty water, possibly mixed with other disgusting fluid, was splashed across the area. As Callum got closer, he stopped and leaned against a wall. He could hear 2 voices, one gruff and very gravely and one clean and clear. He listened. "Yeah man, he's gotten more restless now. Can't blame him considering he lost Kyle and Ash. Poor guy. Nobody wants to be far away from home. Anyways, how much you want?" The gruff voice was then replied to by the clear voice. "Just a couple grams. As much as I can afford. I have a couple of bucks, so that should be about, say, 2 grams. Callum turned to Michael and signaled to him that it was the time to strike. The 2 men felt a cold shiver suddenly run up their spines as the 2 boys slowly walked around the corner. The drug dealer immediately pulled up his coat and hid the cocaine behind his back. The customer quickly stuffed the dollar bills into his pockets. Michael called out to them. "Morning gentlemen. I see we are having a little crack deal here. How much for all of it? I'll be glad to get rid of it." Nearly as soon as he finished his sentence, the dealer pulled out a shiny pocket knife and pointed it at Michael. Callum chuckled and spoke. Now, there is no need for violence. My brother was simply asking a question. However, should you choose to attack us?" Then, simultaneously the 2 boys revealed their demonic faces, shocking both of the men who stood before them. The customer staggered back, shocked at what he just saw, and the dealer stood there, frozen with fear. "Then we'll have to grant your death wish." Callum and Michael rushed towards the 2 figures, readying their weapons. The dealer took a swing at Michael, slicing through the air with the sharp blade in his hand, but he was no match for Michael. Michael swung his leg and drove his knee deep into the side of his ribs. The impact caused the man to flail through the air, dropping his knife. Callum then leapt high into the air, raising his elbows and slammed him to the ground. The dealer's body became lifeless as soon as it made contact with the concrete ground. The customer, having enough of witnessing this massacre, turned and fled. The boys instantly charged after him, raising their spikes. Michael jumped up at the customer, grabbing his shoulders and flipping over him. As the customer came to a grinding halt, Callum slashed at his back. Before he could scream in pain, he was soon silenced by Michael. The 2 boys stood there, breathing in heavily. Their hunt was over. For a few moments, they stood there, trying to catch their breath, when they heard a voice from behind them. "Oh God! Joe!" They spun around to meet the faces of 6 men, all dressed in black and white suits. They ranged in size, from medium size to huge people. The man in the middle who had caught the boys' attention then spoke in a much more aggressive tone. You did this to him. You little freaks. You're going straight to hell." Callum looked at Michael, slightly panicking. "I haven't faced this many. What's your plan?" Michael stood there, not taking his eyes off the men who faced him. He then said quietly, "Tick-tock." Callum's eyes widened. Then, he smiled devilishly. Before the men could react, Callum sprinted at them and, in a few seconds, jumped between 2 of the men and jammed himself between them. His spikes dug into one of their stomachs and his legs quickly latched onto the other man's sides. The other 4 men surrounded Callum, unaware of Michael's plan. Just as they surrounded him, Michael slipped between a gap and began to spin around on his brother's back, slicing and stabbing everything around him. From above, the scene was like watching the hands on a clock turn at great speeds. Eventually, the fight had finished. Callum fell to the floor, gasping for breath and rubbing his spine. Michael pulled him onto his feet and passed him a bottle of water which he had taken from his backpack. He chugged away until the bottle was bone dry. Callum belched and then took a look at his surroundings. The alleyway was littered with bodies, all bruised and bloody. The dirty waters were now mixed with blood. What once was a somewhat disturbing alleyway was now a crime scene. The boys ran out of the alleyway, searching for a new place to hide. As they left, a car window slowly winded down and a middle-aged man looked out, watching the boys as they fled the scene, his eyes filled with rage. "Goddamn! Did you see that, Benjamin?" The butler nodded, closing his eyes in an attempt to hide the fear and sadness they portrayed. "Sir, what do you want me to do?" "It's up to you, sir." The mysterious figure sitting in the car sighed, rubbed his face and then pulled out a shiny phone from his pocket. After a minute of quick texts, he placed the phone onto the seat next to him. He then spoke. "Listen, I've just told the others to follow me. Drive after those boys. Don't let them get away, but make sure they can't detect us." The engine started, and the large black Jeep slowly began to make its journey down the road, packed to the near brim with cars of all shapes and sizes. Callum and Michael were still in the man's sight when he spoke. "Oh, and Benjamin? You can call me Jerry." The block of flats blended in well with the city, practically a concrete chameleon. The dim lights that glared out from its 6 windows barely stood a chance against the neon lights of New York. Callum and Michael approached the building, gazing up at the old block of flats and quirking their eyebrows. Even though it wasn't a very decent place, they had no choice but to sleep there. They looked at one another, nodded and then walked towards the block, unaware of the dark presence of the black Jeep that had followed them the entire way. "So, what parts are you from?" Callum looked at the girl in front of him. She was a gothic girl, complete with black hair, red highlights, and dark makeup. They had begun to talk to each other in the hallway outside his newly taken room. "My brother and I came from Minnesota. We decided to travel together and explore the world. What about you, Rose?" Rose smiled sweetly and brushed her hair aside. "I'm from California. I and my father I moved here so he could get a great job he'd been offered. I hope you don't mind me asking, but why do you always keep your hood up, Callum?" A sudden feeling of dread shocked through Callum. It felt like a large rock had dropped down his stomach. He stuttered, paused and then spoke. "Ah, you see, me and my brother, we were in an accident and we have huge scars. I mean, really bad scars. We always put our hoods over because of that." Rose nodded. Callum really did like this girl. Out of all the people he had met, she was the one who had made him feel accepted, considering what he had become. Even though he really liked Rose, he couldn't be with her. Callum knew that if he loved her, he wouldn't drag her into the dangerous world that he lived in. Michael was fast asleep long before Callum had entered the room. In the depths of his mind, he was dreaming. He was standing on a large bridge. He could see a long concrete path, shelters, and benches on either side. The entire place was surrounded by a swirling mist, making it difficult for him to see. After standing there for a few moments, taking in all of the surroundings, he then began to walk. Back in reality, Callum and Rose were still talking. "Yeah, the shop's pretty cool. We have a workshop in the back where we make all kinds of crazy junk." An idea popped into Callum's head. Perhaps he could steal some parts for new weaponry. But then again, would it be fair on Rose? No, he loved her. Callum couldn't do that to her. "That sounds cool. Perhaps I and Michael could visit sometime." Back in the dream, as Michael continued to walk, he felt a small tugging pain at the top left corner of his ribs. It felt somewhat like a tearing pain. But Michael continued to walk. There was something in the distance that was silently beckoning him, begging him to come further. Returning to reality, Callum was about to ask Rose a question. "So, Rose, I was thinking, want to hang out together tomorrow?" Rose giggled, blushing slightly. "Yeah, that'd be awesome. Bring your brother too. We can." She stopped, her eyes widening. Callum looked at her, confused and concerned. Why had she stopped? Was she okay? What was it that she had forgotten? In Michael's nightmare, the pain continued to grow as Michael walked, becoming more vicious with each step. He clutched at his chest, feeling the blood trickle from his body. His vision began to blur, everything swirling around him. He could vaguely make out two figures in the distance, one in a dress and the other in a suit. He whispered to himself, "Mum? Dad?" Coming back to reality, Rose was quickly pulling on her coat. "Sorry, I forgot to grab some milk from the shops. I'll be back, see you later, Callum." Rose turned and dashed off down the hallway. Callum reached out, trying to get her attention, but nothing happened. He sighed. Why did she have to leave? He slapped himself in the face, angry for not chasing her. Callum then thought about Michael. Michael awoke suddenly, gasping for breath. He felt the pain of the knife against his chest, luckily not puncturing his skin. His eyes met Jerry's rage-filled glare. He heard him whisper, "Now don't you move, little weasel. It'll all be over soon." Michael screamed out, "Callum, help me." Not a second after the words left his lips, Callum kicked the door open. Jerry, panicking, raised the knife and prepared to stab it straight into the practically helpless Michael. Callum took one quick step, spun round, crouched onto the floor and kicked Jerry straight in the ribs. A hard crack emitted from Jerry's body as he hit the wall. Michael grabbed Callum's hand and the two left the room as Jerry fell onto the bed. He looked up, just to have the door slam shut, eliminating the light. The wooden room was filled with all kinds of machines and tools. The ceiling was covered in multicolored wires and skylights dotted the wire-infested support. Callum and Michael sat on two chairs, fiddling around with wood sculptures. They had been waiting for Rose for a minute while she grabbed her phone and told her father where she was heading. Using one hand, Michael was flipping the wooden figure around whilst using the mini saw in his other hand to swoop at the figure. Callum spoke to him. "Hey, are you okay after that night last week? No injuries? I'm sorry I couldn't be there sooner. I was talking to Rose." His words trailed off. Callum began to smile, closing his eyes and losing himself in his thoughts of Rose. Her pretty looks, her lovely voice. It was such a shame that he couldn't be with her. He knew she would be horrified if he showed her the truth. Callum was only dragged back into reality by the rather amused voice of his brother. "Do you like Rose? If so, that is so cute." Michael broke into giggles, whilst Callum playfully punched him in the arm. "Whatever, dude. Besides, even if she did find out, we'd be screwed. I can't be with her." Michael ceased his laughter and stared at his brother, amazed. He hadn't seen this side of his brother before in years. He put his hand on Callum's shoulder and spoke to him. "Listen, man, what's up?" Callum sighed, put his wooden figure on the table and turned to his brother. "I was thinking, maybe we have been killing for the wrong reasons. I know it's fun, but think about it. If we change our ways, life would be easier. Perhaps people would like us." Michael looked at his brother, his jaw hanging low. After many years, Callum had finally brought out his emotions. Michael began to think. His brother did have a good point, but would it work? Could it work? Would life actually be easier? After a long time of thinking, Michael spoke. "Well, maybe it is possible. But..." He stopped, having noticed Rose's presence. She stood there in the corridor, one hand on her hip and the other hanging loosely with a smile on her face. "All right then, ready to go?" They nodded and dropped the wooden figures. As they left the shop, the black Jeep nearby turned on its engine and slowly followed the young adults. Inside, Jerry sat in the back seat, staring menacingly at them. A dark grin slowly stretched across his face as a horrific idea slowly formed in his head. Callum slowly got up, not sure what the hell had just happened. He had just been talking to Rose in the alleyway near the supermarket, and then something hit him hard. He looked up to see the black Jeep in front of him and hear the terrified cries of Rose. Michael's hand pulled him up, bringing him to his feet. Callum then saw Jerry, aiming a pistol at Rose's temple. He cried out. "Rose? Let her go, you bastard. Just who the hell are you?" Jerry smiled, his eyes locked onto Callum's. He began to laugh, his maddening chuckles irritating the boys. "Don't you see? The drug dealer worked for me. Those two men you killed to get her home worked for me as well. You've messed with me too many times. I know it isn't the nicest thing in the world to hold your lady friend here hostage. But then again, it isn't funny to kill my bodyguards and break up my business. My name's Jerry, and I'm your worst nightmare." Callum was about to lunge at him, but Michael pulled him back. "He has a gun. We can't go up against him. It's too dangerous." Michael then turned to Jerry and said in a low tone, "What do you want from us? Where should we go?" "We'll go anywhere." Jerry smiled. One of his bodyguards exited the Jeep and threw a large piece of paper at the boys. Callum grabbed the paper and examined it. The paper showed a location in England. The red dot showing the location was labeled Drayton Manor. Callum nodded. "All right then, we'll play your damn game. But if you hurt Rose, I swear to God." Jerry laughed. "Well, considering who you two actually are, I'd say there's just no point swearing to God." Police report. A local shop owner has reported having a large amount of his metal stolen from his shop. All that was left was a note on his desk which read, "We're saving Rouse. We'll return your stuff later. C+M." The man has also reported having his daughter kidnapped by unknown assailants. Police are still on the lookout for these people. Please report to the authorities if you find the girl or the assailants. The midnight sky above the closed theme park was only lit up by the full moon, peeking between the clouds. Atop of the drop tower stood Jerry, surrounded by armed guards. Rose sat next to him, tied up and teary-eyed. He was determined to put an end to the brothers' killing spree. From behind him, he heard horrifying screams and gunshots. He knew they had arrived. He turned, but then his eyes widened. Callum and Michael looked different. Their hoods were equipped with long strips of metal welded into the hems on their hoodies. The spikes they wielded were lined with new small sheets of metal. The hems on their jeans were also equipped with metal strips, and their gloves were covered with metal plates. If he wasn't armed with a gun, Jerry would have been cowering in fear. If they weren't so dark, they would have been knights in shining armor. But they were just killers in body armor, about to become heroes. Michael spoke. "All right, hand over Rose. Any fuss and we'll kill you." Jerry, laughing, pointed the gun at Rose's temple. She continued to let out muffled cries of fear, tears rolling down her cheeks. In red flash, Callum revealed his true face to Jerry, his red eyes filled with fury and his sharp teeth clenched together in a vicious frown. Jerry, his eyes widening further, slowly pulled the gun away from Rouse. Her muffled cries ceased, but the tears continued to fall. Callum spoke. "Oh, I see that's the kind of game you want to play? Well then, allow me to go first." Callum then stopped, looked at the floor and growled. Jerry, smirking confidently, walked towards Callum. He believed that he had won against him. As he continued to approach the hooded demon, he noticed that Michael hadn't moved. He just stood there, his jagged red eyes staring into Jerry's. Jerry stopped and reached out to grab Callum. Suddenly, Callum looked right into Jerry's eyes and roared. His angry scream echoed across the entire park. The wind was blowing straight at Jerry. Callum screamed at him. "Let Rose go." Jerry staggered back, shocked and terrified. As soon as he took 2 steps back, Michael charged towards Jerry and tackled him. As Jerry hit the ground, Callum disappeared within the shadows. Jerry looked up, cringing in pain. Callum had already begun to untie Rouse. Enraged, Jerry charged towards him. Suddenly, he tripped as Michael stuck his leg out and swept Jerry to the floor. Rose coughed and breathed heavily as Callum took the gag out of her mouth. She immediately began asking questions. "What the hell's going on? Who is this guy? What happened to you?" Callum held her close and spoke very hurriedly. "I'm so sorry. I should have told this to you before, but I haven't got enough time. Stay there, and I'll be back." Callum then turned to face Jerry, who had finally risen to his feet and was now aiming his pistol at Callum. Michael quickly joined his brother after appearing from the darkness behind him. It was at this point that their biggest fight began. It would decide the fate of them all. Callum, Michael, Jerry, and Rose all had their lives in danger. The fate of the battle was decided when Jerry pulled the trigger. The 2 boys disappeared into the darkness. Jerry stood motionless, still aiming his gun when Callum charged behind Jerry. As he turned around, Jerry was slashed by Callum's left spike as he sprinted by. Callum then disappeared as Jerry fired at him, his bullets exploding against the floor. As the last bullet exploded, Jerry was suddenly thrown to the floor by Michael. As Jerry looked up, he immediately shot at Michael with a single bullet. The bullet quickly blasted through the air at high speed. Michael quickly raised his open hand and, using the backplate on his glove, blocked the bullet. It exploded, weakening the metal on his glove. Michael then disappeared away into the shadows. Jerry stood up and began shouting into the darkness. "Come on, you bastards. Show yourselves. Fight like men. Where the hell is you?" He could hear their taunting voices, coming from all directions. The sound of their voices was practically being carried around in the blowing wind. "Come on, Jerry. Don't fight it, just surrender. Do you want to know pain as we do?" For a moment, there was silence. No noise. Jerry stood still, listening for the boys. Nothing. All he could hear was the quiet breeze. The dark clouds from above covered the moon, shrouding Jerry in darkness. He slowly turned to Rose, checking that she hadn't made a desperate escape. Then, Michael rushed towards Jerry, raising his spikes. He roared angrily, preparing to kill Jerry. Then, there was silence again. Michael lay on the floor, hunched up and groaning in agony. Jerry shook the fist that he had just used to knock the wind out of the killer. Michael coughed and wheezed, writhing in pain. Jerry laughed and slowly approached the fallen demon. His pained state amused Jerry, causing him to laugh at Michael. He then picked him up by the shoulders and began to drag him to the edge of the tower. He then spoke. "So, it finally comes to this. I've been waiting for a long time to see this. Weeks of planning, and now, I finally get to see you in pain, pure bliss." Jerry had reached the edge of the tower. He then pulled Michael up and hung him over the edge of the tower. Michael looked at Jerry, disgusted. Finally, Jerry let go of Michael and watched him fall into the darkness, to what Jerry believed would be his death. Rose gasped in horror and began to sob softly. Jerry walked away, feeling victorious, but then stopped. He then thought to himself, "Wait, they can teleport through shadows and darkness. So that means... oh God, no." Jerry screamed in horror as he saw Michael rapidly approaching him, his fist raised. Before Jerry could move, Michael's spike penetrated Jerry's stomach. The impact causes him to fly back, far over the edge. As he began to descend, Callum charged from above, tackling him. After a quick descent, Jerry collided with the ground. His bones shattered as he hit the floor. Callum had used his body to cushion the impact. He stared at his body, taking pity at the once living drug lord. "I thought that I was a monster, but you make me look human." The soft rain splattered against the ground, making small puddles as the three young adults took shelter from the rain. Rose wrapped the blanket around herself tightly as Callum looked out the bus shelter window. Michael was talking to someone on the phone. For a few minutes, there was silence. Then Callum spoke. "Rose, I'm sorry." Rose looked at him, confused. "Sorry? What for?" Callum sighed and rubbed his face. He then looked at Rose and pulled off his hood. She looked in amazement at the long black hair that ran down his back. She looked into his red, gem-like eyes. Callum looked at Rose, staring at her sorrowfully, dark red tears running down his shadow-like face. "I shouldn't have dragged you into this. I shouldn't have lied to you. It's my fault that this happened to you." Michael quickly took the phone away from his ear and chimed in. "It's my fault too." Callum responded. "No, it's not, a man." Michael shook his head and went back to the conversation on the phone. Callum turned back to Rose and continued. "I just wanted to keep you safe. I really liked you from the moment I met you. Aside from my brother, you were the only person who made me feel accepted. I didn't tell you the truth because I was worried you would get hurt, and I don't want that because I love you, Rose." Rose stared at Callum, blushing pure red. Callum looked longingly into her eyes. Michael looked at Callum, impressed by his bravery. Rose put her hands on his shoulders, leaning in close, smiling. Her black lips connected with his as the new couple shared their first kiss. Tears rolled from Rose's eyes, messing up her mascara as they held each other, still locked in a kiss. Rose wrapped her arms around Callum's body, her long black fingernails almost tearing through his hoodie. Callum slowly hugged Rose and pulled her in close, slowly being engulfed in a sweet embrace. Michael smiled, happy for his brother. Callum had found something he never thought he would have ever found in his life. He had found love. Rose walked up to her house door, relieved to finally be home. She turned to look at her new boyfriend, Callum, who looked back, smiling. She called out to him. "You will visit me, right?" Callum nodded. "Every day, Rose." She blew a kiss towards him. Callum caught it and held it close to his heart. It broke his heart to just leave her after they had formed a relationship. But deep down, he knew he had to go if he was going to find somewhere to sleep. They waved goodbye to each other. As Callum walked away from her house, he could hear the joyed cries of Rose and her father. He smiled, feeling proud of himself. He had saved her life and reunited Rose with her father. He felt like a hero, but there was something he had to do first. The two boys walked down the road, triumphant. Finally, after a few minutes, Michael broke the silence. "You know, I think you're right. We have a chance to change our ways. What do you say?" Callum nodded. "Yeah, let's do it. We gotta kill people who've done wrong. Let's start over." On that day, a change was made. For the first time in history, demons became heroes. The once feared killers were able to change their ways. Callum and Michael were able to leave their twisted past behind and do good for the world. On that day, two demons changed their dark ways, for the better.